In the spring of 1979, people in a Soviet city began to die. Not in a battlefield, not in a war zone, not after an explosion anyone could see. They became sick quietly, a fever, weakness, chest pain, trouble breathing. Then the illness changed. It moved fast, it turned severe, and for many of the people who reached the hospital, there was very little doctors could do. The city was Sverdlovsk, a major industrial center in the Ural Mountains, a closed Soviet city, a place of factories, military production, secrecy, and restricted access. And when the authorities finally gave an explanation, it was simple. Bad meat, contaminated livestock, an unfortunate food safety incident, a local outbreak, nothing more. On the surface, the story had the right ingredients. Anthrax can infect animals. People can become infected from contaminated meat. The Soviet Union had regions where anthrax occurred naturally, so the official version was not absurd. That is what made it useful. It was plausible enough to survive the first questions, but there was a problem. The deaths did not behave like food poisoning. They did not spread through families who shared meals. They did not cluster around markets. They did not follow the routes of a meat supply. They followed something else. A line, a narrow corridor of illness, cutting through the city and extending southward from a military compound. And when investigators later placed that line against the wind direction from early April 1979, the shape became difficult to ignore. Contaminated meat does not follow the wind. A cloud does. This is the story of Sverdlovsk, 1979, the biological accident the Soviet Union denied. The outbreak explained away as bad meat, and the invisible plume that left a map behind. Sverdlovsk was not an ordinary Soviet city. During the Cold War, it was part industrial fortress, part military machine. It produced weapons, machinery, and strategic equipment. Foreigners could not simply travel there. Information moved in controlled channels. Public facts and state secrets existed side by side, but the line between them was guarded. Inside that city was a military microbiology facility known to Western analysts as Compound 19. To the public, it was not the kind of place that announced itself, but to intelligence agencies, it mattered. The Soviet Union had signed the Biological Weapons Convention in 1972. On paper, that convention banned the development, production, and stockpiling of biological weapons, but paper and reality are not always the same thing. By the late 1970s, Western governments already had questions about Soviet biological research. They suspected that some facilities were not purely defensive. They suspected that work continued behind classifications, military covers, and scientific language. Then, in April 1979, reports began to move out of Sverdlovsk. Not official reports at first. Fragments, a strange outbreak, sudden deaths, anthrax, a military facility nearby. For a government trying to understand whether the Soviet Union was complying with the Biological Weapons Convention, the timing and location were impossible to ignore. But Moscow had an answer ready. The outbreak was natural. People had eaten contaminated meat. Local animals were infected. There was no weapons accident, no release, no violation, no story, just bad meat. To understand why that explanation mattered, you have to understand anthrax. Anthrax is caused by Bacillus anthracis, a bacterium that can form spores. Those spores are tough. They can survive in soil for long periods. They can infect animals grazing in contaminated areas, and in certain forms they can infect humans. There are different routes of infection. Cutaneous anthrax enters through the skin. Gastrointestinal anthrax can follow the consumption of contaminated meat. Inhalation anthrax is different. It begins when spores are breathed in, and that distinction changes everything. A foodborne outbreak leaves one kind of pattern. An airborne release leaves another. Food moves through cellars, kitchens, families, workplace cafeterias, markets. Its pattern is social. It follows distribution. Air moves with physics. It follows wind. So when the Soviet Union blamed contaminated meat, the key question was not simply whether anthrax could come from meat. It could. The question was whether Sverdlovsk looked like that kind of outbreak, and the answer, slowly, became no. The official Soviet account described a natural outbreak connected to infected livestock and contaminated meat. Soviet representatives told American officials that anthrax outbreaks occurred in the Sverdlovsk region, and that this one had no connection to the Biological Weapons Convention. That was the diplomatic position. But Western analysts were looking for something more precise. Where did the victims live? Where did they work? When did they become ill? Where were the animal cases? What was the wind doing? At first, the picture was incomplete. The Soviet Union was not opening its files. It was not handing over maps, autopsy data, or facility records. The outside world had to work with fragments, reports, interviews, and later, painstaking field investigation. But the fragments did not support the meat story. The strongest evidence was not a confession. It was geography. When known cases were mapped, they did not appear randomly across Sverdlovsk. They appeared in a narrow zone extending from the area of Compound 19 toward the southern edge of the city. Animal cases were also identified farther along that same general axis. That pattern became the spine of the investigation. Because if people had eaten contaminated meat, the cases should have appeared where the meat went. But if spores had escaped into the air, the cases should have appeared where the wind carried them. And that is what the map showed. A plume. This is the part of the story that makes Sverdlovsk so chilling. The accident did not need a fireball. It did not need a crater. It did not need a dramatic visible event. A biological accident can happen silently. A filter fails. A system is mismanaged. A production process releases something that should never reach open air. And for the people outside, nothing looks different. The sky does not change. The street does not change. The morning does not announce itself as dangerous. People go to work. They stand outside. They breathe. That was enough. The leading reconstruction points to an accidental aerosol release from Compound 19 in early April 1979. The exact operational details remain disputed and partly hidden, but the epidemiological pattern became increasingly clear. An airborne release of anthrax spores had moved downwind from the facility. The amount released may have been small in physical terms. That is another disturbing part. In a later scientific analysis, researchers concluded that the quantity of spores released as aerosol could have ranged from only milligrams to nearly a gram. That is not a dramatic mass. It is not a truckload. It is not a visible cloud rolling through a city. It is something almost impossible to see. But with the wrong agent, in the wrong form, under the wrong conditions, invisible can still be catastrophic. In the hospitals, the official story and the medical reality began to separate. The state could say, meat, but bodies tell stories too. Inhalation anthrax does not behave like ordinary food poisoning. It can begin with symptoms that resemble a common respiratory illness. Then it can progress rapidly into severe disease. For doctors, especially under political pressure, the early signs may not immediately reveal the scale of what has happened. But as cases accumulated, the pattern became harder to explain. These were not simply people with stomach illness after a bad meal. Many of the fatal cases were consistent with inhalational disease, and inhalation anthrax points to a different route of exposure. Not a plate, not a butcher's stall. Air. That was the central contradiction. The public explanation said one thing. The medical pattern suggested another. The map suggested another. The wind suggested another. The more the evidence accumulated, the less the meat story looked like an explanation. It began to look like a cover. But in 1979, cover stories could last. This was the Cold War. The Soviet Union did not operate in a media environment where state failures became open public investigations. A military biological facility was not going to become the subject of transparent public hearings. Families were not going to receive a full technical account of what had happened. The state narrative was the boundary of acceptable truth. There had been contaminated meat. There had been an outbreak. The matter was local. The matter was contained. And anyone outside the Soviet Union asking questions could be dismissed as hostile. Western propaganda, political accusation, Cold War pressure. That was the advantage of the official explanation. It did not have to prove everything. It only had to create enough doubt to delay, enough doubt to avoid disclosure, enough doubt to keep the facility hidden. And for years, that was enough. But the United States did not let the matter disappear. The incident raised questions under the Biological Weapons Convention. In 1980, American officials pressed the Soviet government for consultations. The US wanted information about the nature of the disease, the cause of the outbreak, the number of people affected, the geographical extent, the duration and background data about normal anthrax incidents in the Sverdlovsk region. That list of questions was clinical, but beneath it was a much larger concern. If the outbreak came from a military biological facility, then this was not simply a Soviet public health failure. It was evidence that something prohibited may still have existed. The State Department assessment was careful. It did not claim to know everything. But it stated that the April 1979 accident provided evidence that biological warfare stocks were involved. That sentence matters, not because it solved every detail, but because it reveals how the event was understood inside the US government. Sverdlovsk was not treated as a normal rural anthrax outbreak. It was treated as a possible window into a hidden biological weapons program, and that made the Soviet denial more consequential. If the official meat story was false, it was not only hiding deaths, it was hiding a program. For years, the truth remained suspended between two versions. The Soviet version, contaminated meat; the Western suspicion, an accidental release from a military microbiology facility. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. And with the collapse came a brief opening. Archives shifted. Officials spoke. Investigators gained access that would have been impossible before. In 1992, Boris Yeltsin acknowledged that the outbreak had been caused by military researchers connected to germ warfare work, not by the natural causes previously claimed. He had been the Communist Party chief in Sverdlovsk at the time of the 1979 outbreak, which made the admission especially significant. That did not instantly answer every scientific question, but it changed the frame. The denial had cracked. Now investigators could look again. A team led by Matthew Messelson examined the outbreak in detail. They interviewed relatives. They reconstructed where victims had been. They studied hospital records, wind data, and the geography of the city. And when they plotted the data, the same pattern appeared: a narrow zone, downwind from Compound 19. The conclusion, published in Science in 1994, was direct. The outbreak resulted from an aerosol that originated at the compound. That was the moment the map became history. Not rumor, not speculation, a scientific reconstruction. The meat story had not survived contact with geography. There is a strange detail in this case that makes it even more powerful. The homes of the victims did not form a simple pattern. At first glance, that could have helped the Soviet explanation. If people lived in different places, perhaps they were exposed through a distributed food supply. But the more important question was not only where they slept, it was where they were when the release likely occurred. Where did they work? Where were they during the day? Were they inside the projected path of the Plume? When investigators reconstructed working locations and movement, the pattern sharpened. The victims had been positioned along the downwind corridor. This is what makes Plume epidemiology so different from ordinary outbreak investigation. The point is not only the home address, it is the location at the moment of exposure. A person can live outside the Plume and work inside it. A person can live near the facility but not be in the wind path. A person can be miles away but directly downwind. Disease in this case was not measuring distance, it was measuring direction. That is why the line mattered, not because it was dramatic, because it was diagnostic. The Soviet explanation had another weakness. If contaminated meat caused the outbreak, the disease should have been tied to consumption. Investigators should have found a common food source, a market, a batch, a distribution chain. But the downwind pattern did not require a shared meal. It required shared air, and that was far more consistent with inhalation anthrax. The official story also had to explain why animal cases appeared along the same extended corridor south of the city. That is difficult for a meat distribution story. But it is exactly the kind of thing an airborne release can produce. The Plume does not stop where the city stops. It continues until the agent disperses, settles, or loses concentration. That is why Sverdlovsk became more than an accident. It became a model, a case study in how an invisible release can be reconstructed from bodies, maps, and weather. The state could control newspapers, it could control public statements, it could deny the facility. But it could not change the wind. There was another layer that took decades to resolve. What exactly was the anthrax strain? For a long time, the biological details were obscured by politics. If the material came from a weapons facility, was it engineered? Was it modified? Was it designed to resist treatment or evade vaccines? Those questions mattered, because they shaped how the world understood the danger. Then, years later, scientists sequenced DNA from preserved autopsy specimens connected to the Sverdlovsk victims. The results were important and easy to misunderstand. The genome showed no evidence of deliberate genetic engineering, no clear sign that the strain had been manipulated for antibiotic resistance or other special traits. It was consistent with a wild-type Russian strain. That finding did not clear the facility. It did not mean the accident was harmless, and it did not mean the material could not have been part of a weapons program. A biological weapon does not have to be genetically modified. An ordinary pathogen can become a weapon through production, concentration, drying, storage, and delivery. That is the quieter lesson. The frightening part of Sverdlovsk is not that someone created a futuristic designer organism. The frightening part is that they may not have needed to. A natural pathogen handled inside a military production system was enough. No science fiction, no engineered monster. Just anthrax, industrialized, classified, and released into the air. This is where the story becomes more than a Cold War mystery, because Sverdlovsk exposes a specific kind of danger. Not only the danger of biological weapons, the danger of denial. When a chemical plant explodes, the evidence is visible. When a reactor burns, radiation can be measured, but a biological release can be hidden inside ordinary disease. A fever becomes a statistic, a cough becomes a diagnosis, a death certificate becomes a controlled document. If the state controls the medical records, the press, the investigators, and the facility itself, the outbreak can be given another name: food poisoning, natural disease, local contamination. Nothing unusual, and for the families that means the truth is delayed. For the outside world, it means the risk is misunderstood. For future responders, it means the most important data may be buried when it matters most. That is why the cover story was not just immoral, it was dangerous. A false explanation does not only protect the institution responsible, it interferes with the response. It changes what doctors look for. It changes what investigators map. It changes how fast treatment, vaccination, and containment measures are targeted. In a biological event, truth is not abstract. Truth is part of the emergency response. Think about the people in the city. They did not know they were inside a geopolitical case study. They were workers, relatives, parents, friends. Some were at factories, some were outdoors, some were simply in the wrong place, in the wrong wind, on the wrong day. They were not soldiers. They were not test subjects. They were civilians living beside a secret. That is one of the most disturbing features of Cold War infrastructure. The line between military research and civilian life was often physical: a fence, a wall, a checkpoint, a restricted compound beside a working city. But the consequences did not respect that line. Spores do not stop at a gate. Wind does not ask for clearance. When containment fails, secrecy becomes useless to the people outside. The facility may be classified. The exposure is not. And yet for years, Sverdlovsk remained officially misdescribed. That is why the story feels almost unreal. The evidence was not subtle forever. The deaths formed a corridor. The corridor matched the wind. The wind led back toward Compound 19. Still, the official explanation remained contaminated meat. That phrase, contaminated meat, becomes more disturbing the longer you sit with it, because it is not just a lie. It is a replacement reality. It takes an industrial military accident and turns it into a market problem. It takes an airborne release and turns it into dinner. It takes a classified failure and gives it the smell of an ordinary public health mistake. That is how cover stories work best. They do not always sound impossible. They sound boring. They sound local. They sound like something you can file away. Bad meat. Case closed. But the case did not close. After 1992, with access to victims' families, maps, records, and biological samples, researchers were able to reconstruct enough of the event to overturn the official version. The National Security Archive later collected declassified material around the outbreak, including US efforts to determine what happened and Soviet efforts to maintain the contaminated meat explanation. The scientific literature made the geography central. The diplomatic record showed how seriously the United States treated the event. The genomic research added a final layer. The strain did not appear to be genetically engineered, which made the story less like a fantasy and more like a failure of industrial military biology. And maybe that is why Sverdlovsk still matters. It is not the most cinematic kind of disaster. There is no single famous photograph, no mushroom cloud, no collapsing building, no image that explains everything in one frame. The evidence is quieter: a line on a map, a wind direction, hospital admissions, autopsy samples, diplomatic cables, a denial repeated until history finally broke it open. For a channel like this, that is exactly the point. Some secrets do not look dramatic when they happen. They become dramatic only when the pattern is revealed. There is also a deeper irony. The Soviet Union was not alone in understanding the military potential of biology. The Cold War made both superpowers think in catastrophic categories: missiles, submarines, nuclear war, chemical agents, biological agents. The difference with Sverdlovsk is that the disaster was not theoretical. It was not a war plan. It was not a test range. It was a city, and the agent escaped. That makes Sverdlovsk one of the clearest warnings from the biological side of the Cold War. Not because it shows what happens when a biological weapon is used deliberately, but because it shows what happens when a biological weapon system exists at all. Production creates risk. Storage creates risk. Maintenance creates risk. Secrecy multiplies that risk. And when something goes wrong, the same system built to hide the program can be used to hide the accident. That is the nightmare architecture. The weapon is secret. The failure is secret. The victims are explained away. By the time the truth emerged, the Soviet Union no longer existed. Sverdlovsk had become Yekaterinburg. The Cold War had ended, but the map remained. The line remained. The lesson remained. In the end, Sverdlovsk was not solved by one heroic disclosure. It was solved piece by piece, by survivors and families, by doctors and pathologists, by investigators who plotted addresses and workplaces, by scientists who compared disease patterns to wind, by later genetic work that clarified what the organism was and what it was not. That is what makes the case so valuable. It shows how truth can survive inside fragments, even when the state denies it, even when the documents are hidden, even when the official story is repeated for years. A biological accident leaves traces, not always obvious traces, but enough. In tissue, in timing, in geography, in weather. And in Sverdlovsk, those traces all pointed in the same direction: downwind. So what really happened in 1979? The most supported reconstruction is this. Anthrax spores were accidentally released from a Soviet military microbiology facility in Sverdlovsk. The spores moved with the wind. People in the path of that plume inhaled them. Some developed fatal inhalation anthrax. The Soviet Union blamed contaminated meat. Western governments suspected a biological weapons accident. Years later, after the Soviet collapse, that interpretation was effectively confirmed. And decades after that, genomic analysis showed that the strain itself was not some engineered super pathogen. It was something simpler, and in some ways, more frightening: an ordinary organism inside an extraordinary system. That is the final lesson of Sverdlovsk. The danger was not only the microbe, it was the machine around it. The facility, the secrecy, the denial, the political need to make the evidence say something else. Because when a state can classify the cause of death, an outbreak becomes more than a medical event. It becomes an intelligence problem, a diplomatic problem, a moral problem. And for the people caught in the plume, it becomes something even simpler. A day that began like any other, and ended inside a secret they were never meant to know. Before we close this file, there is one detail worth holding on to. For years, the official explanation was meat, a simple object, a physical thing, something you can point to. But the real evidence was invisible: air, wind, direction. That is why Sverdlovsk is such a powerful case, because the lie was solid, but the truth moved. And eventually, the wind drew the map. If you find stories like this valuable, not rumors, not internet mythology, but documented Cold War history reconstructed from archives, science, and declassified records, subscribe to Redacted Briefing, because the most disturbing files are not always the ones with the most dramatic explosions. Sometimes they are the quiet ones, the ones where people died, officials gave a simple answer, and the real story survived only because someone kept asking where the evidence pointed. This was Sverdlovsk, 1979. The anthrax outbreak blamed on contaminated meat, and the map that pointed back to a military facility.